بسم الله بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والعاقبة للصالحين ونصلي ونسلم ونبارك على سيدنا الأولين والآخرين سيدنا المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. So inshallah we're going to continue in our pursuit of learning and understanding the meanings of the Qur'an, and inshallah we will begin a new chapter today, and that will be Sūrah al-Anʿam, the 6th chapter of the Qur'an, inshallah. Just get my notes here. And we will begin by looking at a few notes again from Sheikh At-Tayyar, Sheikh Musa'ad At-Tayyar, Hafidhahullah. We will begin by looking at some of his commentary on the introduction to Ibn Juzay's tafsir. So Ibn Juzay al-Kalbi, rahmatullahi alayhi, is the mufassir, the scholar whose tafsir that we've, one of the main ones we look at. And so we're going to look at, again, just a couple of, every week we look at a little bit of what he has to say, so that we learn some of the methodology associated with those scholars. So Ibn Juzay wrote in the introduction, talking about his approach to commenting on the Qur'an and some of his approach to scholarship, he wrote, وَلَقَدْ أَوْدَعْتُهُ مِنْ كُلِّ فَنٍّ مِنْ فُنُونِ عِلْمِ الْقُرْآنِ. He said, I have included in my tafsir all types or all variants of the different sciences of the Qur'an. As a note, you will see here that sometimes the ulama, the scholars, will use the word fan in its plural funun, and they will also then use the word ilm and ulum, ilm being the singular and ulum being the plural. And those are used interchangeably. I know that in some contexts, the word fen could mean an art, and not that you couldn't use the as long as we understand it's not about painting, right? So it is an art, meaning that it's something beyond merely the technical, and so it involves, like being a painter. The reason why it would be referred to as a fen, because it involves knowing many different things and understanding light and shadow, understanding color theory, all different types. It's in a sense a sort of a repository of which contains many different skill sets. So Ibn Juzay says, I've included in my tafsir min kulli fannin min fununin ilm al-Qur'an, as it relates to all those. And Sheikh Musa'ad says what? نُحَالِذ أَنَّهُ قَالَ أَوَّلًا. And so we notice that he first said, صنفت هذا الكتاب. Ibn Juzay said, then I have compiled this book في تفسير القرآن العظيم وسائر ما يتعلق به من العلوم. I have compiled this book using many different areas of knowledge as it relates to the interpretation of the Qur'an, as well as any science or any field of knowledge that would be related to that. So you might say, well, what would that be? Well, it could be reports or things that the Sahaba had to say. So akhbar. It could be lughawi or nahwi. It could be things related to language, and so on and so on. رجع مرة أخرى وقال. And then he returns back to commenting on it and says in this Ibn Juzay, وَلَقَدْ أَوْدَعْتُهُ مِنْ كُلِّ فَنٍّ مِنْ فُنُونِ الْقُرْآنِ مِنْ عِلْمِ الْقُرْآنِ اللُّبَابِ الْمَرْغُوبِ فِيهِ دون القشر المرغوب عنه. And so, having included all those different sizes, with the desired essence, without an unwanted lining, meaning without a lot of pretense. So the approach that Ibn Juzay, he wants to make a tafsir that is unpretentious, that is not overly filled with unnecessary redundancies or things that go too far off into tangents, wants it to be concise. وهذا يشير إلى ما ذكرته سابقا من أن إدخال مساعي بعض أنواع علوم القرآن من مقاصد ابن جزي في تفسيره هذا. And so this indicates, this is Sheikh Musa'id speaking, that this mentions this indicates what I mentioned earlier, that the inclusion of issues related to certain types of Quranic sciences was amongst his objective, right? It's meaning that, again, he talked about last time, in order for us to appreciate, understand, and even if we were to be critical of a particular work of research, of tafsir, or any other work, one, we must know, well, what were the objectives of the scholar? And so that's what Imam Ibn Juzay al-Kalbi, he's saying, I had X, Y, and Z objectives in my tafsir. So we have to base it on that. ثم قال من غير إفراط ولا تفريط. Ibn Juzay said, I wanted to make a tafsir, I wanted to make a commentary on the Qur'an that did not have excessive amounts of information, but also was not deficient in it. And we'll come back to what that might mean here in a second. Sheikh Musa'id says, كأنه يقول, it's as if he says, جعلته وجيزا مختصرا ليس فيه ذلك الحشو ولا ذلك التطويل. I made it concise and brief without unnecessary elaboration or excessive length. However, Sheikh Musa'id will point out in some notes that can go to, I wouldn't say to an extreme, but potentially that can create issues, especially if that is a tafsir that is going to be read by non-experts, especially if it's a tafsir that will be read by non-experts. ثم قال ثم إني عزمت على إيجاز العبارة وإفراط الاختصار وترك التأويل والتكرار. So then Ibn Juzay continues by saying, then I resolved to make those expressions concise, to be brief, and to avoid elaboration and repetition. Meaning that if there's 20 reports related to this and they're mainly similar, then Ibn Juzay will give us one and move along. There's no need to go into the other 19, so to speak. That's not the type of tafsir that it is. Now there are other tafasir that do that, and that's great. It says بدأ بذكر الأسلوب الكتابي. So he starts with a mention about the style of writing that he's going to do. الذي سينتهجه في عبارته في هذا التفسير. And so he's letting us know, well, what is the style that he's going to adopt, right, in as it relates to that. Now I said I wanted to comment briefly on this issue. And that is specifically related to what Sheikh al-Musa'id talks about. And that's specifically related to, well, what happens if things are too brief? Right? What if there's too much brevity in a thing? And so what he's saying is, if, for instance, you could have a tafsir like, and I believe he mentions here, and I'm looking at my notes. Yes, he mentions here, for instance, tafsir al-Baydawi and al-Jalalain. The second one in particular, perhaps you're more familiar with as it relates to tafsir. You may have heard of the tafsir Jalalain. Often it is one volume and it will be a tafsir that will be like, there will be a verse of the Qur'an, and maybe there'll be only one word, it'll explain something. And so what he's saying is that that can create a problem, because sometimes by being too short and too concise, you can create other problems. So he says, وَقَدْ لَحَظَ صَاحِبْ كِتَابْ مِنْهَجْ ibn Juzay. Right? And so he says the author of a book, there's another scholar that also wrote a book about the methodology of Ibn Juzay in his tafsir. He says that إن هذا الإفراط في الاختصار قد يصل إلى أن يكون فيه غضوض في العبارة. So he said that, for instance, brevity or being shortness in explanation can sometimes lead to ambiguity. غموض. It can lead to ambiguity in the explanation. And it says, والكاتب وهو يكتب أحيانا يكتب ما في ذهنه فيحس. So that sometimes when he writes down and tries to express his thoughts and his, his feelings, وهو يكتب أنه قد أبان على عبارة وأن من سيقرأ له سيفهم. So when the writer sometimes writes down his or her thoughts or their feelings about a thing, the goal is to make those thoughts clear, so that when somebody else comes along and reads it, right, وأنه من سيقرأه له سيفهم. So that when somebody later along comes along and reads it, they understand. But if you just take a verse and you write, well, it's this one thing, then he says, وَالْوَاقِعْ أَنَّ الْعِبَارَةَ قَدْ تَكُنْ مَدْغُوطَةً جِدًّا. Sometimes he says, well, sometimes that can actually create, you take an expression that should be clear, by being so concise, you make it unclear. And so Ibn Juzay is trying to find a happy medium between being concise and making a commentary on the Qur'an that flows in its reading, in some ways like how the Qur'an itself has a flow or a style, not wanting to detract from that, and also to make that accessible to the non-scholar, even though obviously his tafsir is a great tafsir and will benefit people even of ilm, people of knowledge, of scholars, but even a lay person, inshallah, could open and benefit, because it tries to find the middle point between being concise and then not so concise that it can lead to ambiguity. And so he mentions a few of those. So he says, for instance, if you take من كتاب التفسير التي تتميز بضغط العبارة, is actually tafsir al-Baydawi. So al-Baydawi, who was he lived and passed away towards the latter part of the 7th century Hijrah, and his is considered one of the great books of collections of tafsir. The issue with al-Baydawi is that sometimes he's very brief in his explanation of something, that unless you are another scholar, it might not be clear what he means by that. And so, and another, he says, for instance, al-Jalalain. And so kind of in praise of Ibn Juzay's tafsir, he says, هذا الغموض في عبارة أحد أسباب اعتماد هذا الكتاب منهجا تدريسيا عند علماء الترك. So because Ibn Juzay was able to find this happy medium between being concise but also being clear in the definitions of things, it's in many ways, this is the reason why his methodology has been adopted by many Turkish scholars in the way that they teach tafsirs. بحيث أن الطالب يحتاج إلى المعلم لفك عبارات هذه الكتاب. Whereas with the other style, right, where the student would need the teacher to decipher everything for them. Where Ibn Juzay's style, it's clear, it's straightforward, and so there isn't this need. The student would have not as much need for the teacher to hold their hand and walk them through it. So that's just a quick reflection of some of the things that Ibn Juzay had to say about his tafsir. Okay. Bismillah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. الحمد لله الذي خلق السماوات والأرض وجعل الظلمات والنور ثم الذين كفروا بربهم يعدلون. Now we begin the 6th chapter of the Qur'an and we open up to the first verse. It opens up with tahmid. It opens with Allah Ta'ala saying that He is worthy of all praise and the one alone who has created the heavens and the earth and has also then made dhulumat and nur. So two things that we can note immediately is that Allah Ta'ala is both the creator, that He takes things that did not exist and He makes them. Then Allah Ta'ala takes things that He has already made and then He has ja'ala. And of course ja'ala here also bima'na khalaqa. And then Allah Ta'ala has made. Also, it refers to that everything in creation is there with intentionality. So Allah Ta'ala has made al-dhulumat wa nur. He has made darkness and light. And some of the ulama have said that these are synonyms for night and day. Of course, there are different types of darkness that are not only related to night, and different types of illumination that are not exclusively related to the daytime, but that is some of the commentary that has been said. ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا بِرَبِّهِمْ يَعْدِلُونَ. Then Allah Ta'ala says, and as for those that make kufr, for those that either don't believe or are ungrateful or have gone askew in their creed, in their theology, that when it comes to their Lord, and notice that Allah Ta'ala still refers to Himself as their Lord, even though they are kafirun. Even though they are a kafir, Allah still refers to Himself as their Lord. That they ya'dilun, ya'diluna, that they are the ones that make Allah Ta'ala siwa and indahum. Allah Ta'ala makes, that they make Allah Ta'ala equal with His creation. They make Allah Ta'ala equal with elements of His creation, either in the sky or in the earth, أو ما فيهن, or anything in the two of those, or they make Him equal with the creation of something in darkness or something in light. And so this is one of the ways in which people have gone astray. So he mentions قال كعب أول الأنعام هو أول التوراة. He mentions that one of the commenters said that the very beginning of this surah, al-Anʿam, meaning right, the livestock or the cattle, right, that they are, it is essentially like the beginning of the Torah. In the beginning there was darkness and that kind of thing. So he said it has a similarity to this. In Allah's statement, وَجَعَلَ الظُّلُمَاتِ وَالنُّورَ, جَعَلَ, right, in the statement of Allah Ta'ala saying, and He made darkness and light, the use of جَعَلَ, the verb جَعَلَ here, جَعَلَ هُنَا بِمَعْنَى خَلَقَ. So again, it's to have the same meaning as to create, to bring into existence. وَالظُّلُمَاتِ al-layl, as we mentioned, and that many of the commenters said here that al-dhulumat is nighttime, wan-nuru an-nahar, and Allah talking about nur or light here being what? Daytime. وَالدَّوْ الَّذِي فِي الشَّمْسِ وَالْقَمَرِ وَغَيْرِهِمَا. And this light are things that come from like the sun and the moon and other sources of light. وَإِنَّمَا أَفْرَدَ النُّورِ. And that Allah Ta'ala, when He mentions nur and singles out nur here, the mentioning of light or nur, لِأَنَّهُ أَرَادَ الْجِنْسِ. He mentions nur here as a general category and not as a specific one. وَفِي الْآيَةِ رَدٌّ عَلَى الْمَجُوسِ. And the verse is also a refutation of the Magians. Who were these? These were people who في عبادتهم للنار. These were people that used to worship fire because they saw fire as a source of light and something holy, and so anyway they used to take it as a form of worship. So he says رد على المجيس في عبادتهم للنار وغيرها من الأنوار, as well as anybody else that would worship other forms of light like starlight or moonlight, giving them some level of tahleel, some level of divinity. إن الخير من النور والشر من الظلمة فإن المخلوق لا يكون إلها ولا فاعلا لشيء من الحوادث. And so he mentions that the claims that good, and this is like again the Magians and others, make claims that good comes from light and evil comes from darkness. And so the rebuttal is what? Created things cannot be a God, nor can they be the ultimate causer of events. And this part here actually, when Ibn Juzay comments on this, it made me think, for instance, about the problem of racism. So we think about the problem of racism. And I feel like when it comes to the issue of racism, we have either reached a kind of ridiculousness in our community that if you want to talk about the issue of racism, then you're like some sort of woke this or that. And so, racism, this is just an issue of the left. And as people, as conservative people, which I don't label myself as a conservative, right? We are not concerned with such things, and racism is a fantasy. But if you think about it, so much of the ideology of racism is predicated on things that are dark are evil, and that things that are light are good. Now, certainly, in the Qur'an, Allah does use certain kinds of language that, for instance, He talks about a person whose heart becomes black, right? Aswadda. It's true. Or that, like the Prophet ﷺ talked about, when a person commits sins, there is a black dot that's put on the heart. And if this accumulates, the whole heart will be covered in darkness. And so those things are true in context. But the idea that Allah Ta'ala is talking about and that Ibn Juzay is pointing about here in the verse, this idea that all evil comes from dark, which is to say darkness in itself is evil, and all good comes from sources of light, not from Allah Ta'ala, who is an-nur, who is the light. It just makes you think about, this is the problem when you, as Allah Ta'ala says in the verse, what? ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا بِرَبِّهِمْ يَعْدِلُونَ. That when it comes to the kafir, that they make Allah equal with His creation, meaning that creation is almost like, as Allah says, أَلَهُمْ شُرَكَاءُ شَرَعُوا لَهُمْ مِنَ الدِّينِ مَنْ لَمْ يَأْذَنْ بِهِ اللَّهُ. Do they have associates besides Allah that are able to legislate law, شَرَعَ لَهُمْ مِنَ الدِّينِ, that can legislate law as it relates to deen? مَنْ لَمْ يَأْذَنْ بِهِ اللَّهُ, that which Allah Ta'ala has not legislated or not capable of legislating. So something that gave me a pause to think about. Now in Allah's statement, ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا بِرَبِّهِمْ يَعْدِلُونَ, as we mentioned, and those who disbelieve, those who make kufr with their Lord, they make him equal with his creation. I يُسَوُّونَ وَيُمَثِّلُونَ. They make Allah equal and similar to it. مِنْ قَوْلِكَ عَدَلْتُ فُلَانًا بِفُلَانٍ. Like when you say, I equated so-and-so with so-and-so, or so-and-so is similar to so-and-so. But Allah Ta'ala لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. Allah Ta'ala's mithal has no similitude. It's like you were to say in English, Allah's similitude has no similitude. Allah لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ. Allah has a mithal, but nothing resembles it. It's kind of like mind-bending. إِذَا جَعَلْتُ نَظِيرَهُ وَقَرِينَهُ. It's like when you make someone their counterpart and their peer, making them equal. وَدَخَلَتْ ثُمَّ. Now, as it relates to then Allah's usage of the word ثُمَّ, how is it employed in the sentence? لِتَدِلَّ عَلَى إِسْتِبْعَادٍ. It's used to indicate أَنْ يَعْدِلُوا بِرَبِّهِمْ بَعْدَ وُضُوحِ آيَاتِهِ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. So the word ثُمَّ, or then, is employed in the sentence to indicate the absurdity of equating others with Allah Ta'ala, with their Lord, after Allah giving them signs about the creation of the heavens and the earth. So that Allah Ta'ala has created the heavens and the earth, that they did not create themselves, they have not always existed, then with that being far greater than the creation of them, to then equate Allah with His creation is an act of absurdity, an act of kufr. وَالظُّلُمَاتِ وَالنُّورِ. Now in Allah's statement that Allah Ta'ala also, that He ja'ala al-dhulumat an-nur, that He made al-dhulumat and an-nur. Make sure that my do not disturb is turned down here. He said, وَكَذَلِكَ قَوْلُهُ ثُمَّ أَنْتُمْ تَمْتَرُونَ. Similarly, in Allah's other statements, do you have doubts? Right? Do you have doubts? استبعاد لأن يمتروا فيه بعدما ثبت أنه أحياهم وأماتهم وفي ضمن ذلك تعجيب من فعله وتوبيخ لهم. So he's giving this, asking these questions for us to reconsider our actions, reconsider our conclusions. So it's meant, again, it's meant to express the absurdity of doubting Allah Ta'ala after it has already been established that He is the one that has given life and causes death and no one else. And this also contains an element of something being ajib, ta'ajib, like it's an amazement. And so this kind of, like you'll read in other parts of the Qur'an, that Allah Ta'ala talks about that when they mention that Allah ittakhadallahu walada, when they mention that Allah Ta'ala has taken a son, it's if almost like the heavens and the earth would split themselves asunder, crack itself open, rip itself apart out of amazement from the statement, the absurdity of it. الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا. Then Allah talking about as for those who make kufr, هُنَا عَامٌ فِي كُلِّ مُشْرِكٍ. This applies in general to every kind of polytheist. So here, in general, the feeling is that it's the polytheists that are being addressed and not the people of the book. وَقَدْ يَخْتَصُّ بِالْمُجُوسِ بِدَلِيلِ الظُّلُمَاتِ وَالنُّورِ. Some have said it might deal specifically with the Magians because of Allah Ta'ala mentioning the lightness and darkness. right? وَبِعَبَدَةِ الْأَصْنَامِ, and as well as the idol worshippers. لأنهم المجاورون للنبي صلى الله عليه وسلم, and because they were the ones close to the Prophet ﷺ when these verses are coming down. وعليهم يقع الرد في أقصى القرآن, and that the refutation of the Qur'an is mostly directed at them. As for the second verse, Allah says, هو الذي خلقكم من طين. Allah Ta'ala is the one who has created you from teen. The use of the word, the harf min, this is important in Arabic. By also using the word min, it implies that while we are created from something called teen, if we want to go with the translation of clay, fine. The use of the word min means that this is what you are partially created out of, but not in whole. Partially created out of and not in whole. ثُمَّ قَضَى أَجَلًا, and then Allah Ta'ala decreed for you an ajal, a period of time, as we will see, referring to your life. Each of us have been given a lifespan. وَأَجَلٌ مُسَمًّى, as well as another period of time that will be given. عِنْدَهُ, that is only known to Allah. And then ثُمَّ أَنْتُمْ تَمْتُرُونَ, right? Meaning that we will have our death and we will go back to Allah. But Allah is saying, as to this, you are doubting? How astounding is that? As for Allah's statement, خَلَقَكُم مِّن طِينٍ, that He created you from teen, from clay. أَيْ خَلَقَ آبَاءَكُمْ آدَمَ مِن طِينٍ. They have said this refers to the creation of Adam, our father, from teen. We are created in the womb of our mother, and we go through also another type of creation and birth. But this, they say, is referring to al-khalq al-awwal, the initial creation of our father Adam alayhi salam. As Allah's statement, ثُمَّ قَضَى أَجْرًا وَأَجْرًا مُسَمًّى عِنْدَهُ, that Allah Ta'ala, He decrees an initial period of time for you and then another one only known to Him. He says, al-ajal al-awwal al-maut. The first one means like your life up into your death. وَأَثَانِ يَوْمِ الْقِيَامَةِ. Then the other is going to be, the second period of time will be the resurrection and the day of judgment, the standing before Allah. وَجَعَلَهُ عِنْدَهُ. And Allah kept the knowledge of when this time and this period, only Allah Ta'ala knows when this will happen. لِأَنَّهُ اشْتَأَثَرْ بِعِلْمِهِ. Allah kept this and He reserved this to Himself. وَقِيلَ الْأَوَّلْ النَّوْمِ. It has also been said, as we said, when the scholars say وَقِيلَ versus قَالَ, when they mention this, it's an opinion, but it is not the stronger one. Some have said that this first period of time is sleep, وَأَثَانِ الْمَوْتِ, and the second one is death. And the reason why they're saying is that there is a relationship between sleep and death. وَدَخَلَتْ ثُمَّ, and then the use of ثُمَّ in the verse here again, هُنَا لِتَرْتِيبِ الْأَخْبَارِ. It's so that we know as a guide of how to arrange the statements and the words in the sentence. He says, however, لَا تَرْتِيبِ الْوُقُوعِ. It's not there to be in order of how the events will take place. لأن القضاء متقدم على الخلق, because the decree of Allah, it precedes the creation of those things happening. وَأَثَانِ, oh, I'm sorry, I just repeated my slide there. So it precedes the creation. And so this the chapter is going to open up. And as we will see, al-Anʿam. What are al-Anʿam? Yani al-Hayawanat, animals, cattle, livestock. And Allah Ta'ala opens this by addressing a common mistake of all human cultures at some point in their history is to deify the creation. So Allah is saying all worship, when Allah Ta'ala says Alhamdulillah, it's like saying Al-ibada kullaha lillahi wahda. All worship should then therefore also be to Allah and Allah alone, who is the sole creator. خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ وَحْدَهُ. That Allah Ta'ala has created the heavens and the earth, alone and by Himself. وَجَعَلَ الظُّلُمَاتِ وَالنُّورَ وَحْدَهُ. And that Allah Ta'ala then made lightness and darkness by Himself. And they are part of His makhluqat. They are part of His creation and therefore should not be deified. Darkness, light, the sky, the stars, everything that you see in the heavens, the moon, the stars, the sun, وَمَنْ فِيهِنَّ, the angels that are there, they are not to be worshipped. Likewise, وَخَلَقَ الْأَرْض كُلَّهَا, Allah Ta'ala made the earth, and therefore everything in the earth, الشجر, الحجر, al-anhar, like the al-abhar, the oceans, the rivers, the trees, the birds, the bees. Like, we should not deify creation, but rather see it as a sign. And in some ways, this is like you see in Japanese culture, which I've always said, mashallah, Japanese culture, very unique, very beautiful. The Japanese are very astute at observation. But one mistake that the Japanese have done is that they have deified creation. And that's why in Shintoism, the kind of, the religion, right, because you have the Shinto Buddhists, the Japanese, they took Buddhism, right, from the Chinese, but amongst themselves, they had a kind of shamanistic worship of nature, almost somewhat similar to Native American religions, where they saw the creation as something divine, something worthy of worship, instead of seeing it as a sign, right? Instead of seeing it as a sign. And so this chapter, as we see, is going to start off by addressing shirk and by making a da'wah to call the human being back to worshiping Allah Ta'ala alone. So in Surah Al-Ma'idah, we dealt with a lot of refutation of the people of the book, a lot of criticism of Bani Israel, not unlike in Surah Al-Imran and even in some Surah An-Nisa, criticizing the Jews, the Christians, like the last part of Surah Al-Ma'idah, where Allah was very critical of the Christians and their taking Sayyidina Isa to be worshipped, right? Worshipping Jesus, the Son of Mary. Now Allah Ta'ala is going to then address this broader human tendency, because again, when you look at the earth and the population, aside from the so-called Judeo-Christian aspect, most people fall into some type of shamanistic worship of the creation, a deification of the creation. So we can see here that this is how the chapter, inshallah, is going to start off. And we will continue. We'll just cover these first two ayat here. And then, inshallah, next week we will start with the third verse. Just double check the comments, inshallah, see if anybody had any online. And then we'll take a quick break, and then we'll come back and I will cover a few slides for our Maliki fiqh class. We'll continue to talk about the bab of zakah, inshallah. Jazakumullahu khairan wa salawatullahi ta'ala ala nabiyhi al-kareem wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum.